everybody, thank you for watching this video. Starting from this video, we will start to learn Chapter 9, Aggregate Demand. So before we get into this chapter, I highly recommend you to review what we already learned from Chapter 8, the business cycle, because it's very important for you to still remembering what is recession, what is depression, and also what is aggregate demand or aggregate supply, and what is the macro equilibrium. So those are the basic concepts. We will see it again in this chapter. So to start this chapter, and I want to ask you, so what will affect your consumption patterns? So many students are going to say, oh, it depends on how much money I get from my parents. Or some of you say, depends on how much money I get from my part-time job. So you understand that your consumption pattern is affected by your income. Very good. And also, if you are having more income than what you consume, so where are you going to put your money? Hopefully you will not say I'm going to put it under my pillow because somebody might steal it. So I'm joking. So some students may say, okay, might be putting my money in the stock market and invest it. Or some of you might say, okay, I might just put in the bank and save it. So that's very good. So what you're doing is you use the money to buying goods, saving the money, and you are actually contribute to the aggregate demand. So what you're doing is part of the components for the aggregate demand. So that is consumption. So after you understand that consumption, your own personal consumption pattern. So let's think about the bigger picture about a nation. So I want to ask you, who do you think purchase the goods and the services producing a nation? So think big. So don't just think about yourself. Yes, of course. Number one is every citizen in the nation. So they have to consume, they're gonna buy food, clothes, transportation, oil, gas, energy, etc. So all you guys contribute to the aggregate demand. So we are not called this first component as citizen. We call it consumption. So the consumption. So anything else? Yes, of course, investment. So every day you drive by Erie, you will see the new road might be built, and then the new building might be built. And look at what Erie Insurance is doing. They are building the new sites. So that is considered as investment. So they are also contribute to the aggregate demand, and they are also the investor also the one purchase the goods and the service produced in the nation. So very good. So this is the second component, and the second identity will buy the goods producing a nation, which is investors. How about the third? So I'll give you a story. So last night I drove in the area, and then instantly there is a police car. His lights on and freaked me out. I thought that he's gonna pull me over, but actually it's not. They are actually trying to support other police. I don't know what's happening. And so think about the police car. Who owned it? And that each police officer own that? No. So that owned by government. So the government also purchased the item from the businesses, and also every police got paid, and so the government got involved into the labor market because they purchasing the labors, and so which means the third identity purchasing the goods and the service producing the nation will be the government. And how about the fourth one? Yes, you are right. The international participants, so like people like the Boeing make their aircraft. So Boeing exporting so many aircraft around the world. So obviously the fourth identity by the goods and the services producing the nation will be the foreign buyer consumers. So as I mentioned, there's four identity. You might already start to link what we already learned before. So the four component of our GDP. What is that? Consumption, investment, government purchase, and the net export. So you are right. So actually, when we are learning aggregate demand, we are learning these four components again, and we'll look at how each component actually going to affect our aggregate demand. So that's why you can see why we spend so much time to talk about chapter 5 and also chapter 8, because we're going to use it in our chapter 9 and 10 here. And so after we're discussing this chapter, and hopefully it will make you very interesting about what we're going to learn in this chapter. And so give you a broader view about what we're going to learn. So this chapter provides a close look into the demand side of the product markets. Keep in mind, we're not focusing on the labor markets. We are only looking at the product markets. So using the aggregate supply, aggregate demand analysis. So that is what we'll already look at in chapter 8, shifting the curves. And so the chapter investigated how market forces affected the aggregate demand curve. So the components of the aggregate demand are identified, and each component is investigated in detail. So I'm so sorry I already tell you what are the components. So later we're gonna just focus on how they're gonna affect our aggregate demand. And so this chapter also discusses King's contributions to the better understanding of the consumption and the macroeconomy. So it also explains how change in aggregate demand can provide solutions to macro failures. And so after learning this chapter, and you should be able to know what the major components of aggregate demand are. As I said, I already told you, consumption, investment, and government purchase, and the net export. And so after learning the chapter, you also will be able to know what the consumption function tells us. And also you will be able to know the determinant of the investment spending, and also you should be able to know how and why aggregate demand curve shifts occur. And also you'll be able to know how and when macro failure occurs. So this is our learning objective. And so before we look at everything in detail, I want to help you to think about American history. So it's not far away history. So actually it happened the last quarter of 2008. So if you are already had if you are very about 18, 20, you can ask your parents what happened in 2008. If you already worked, if you're an adult student, and you definitely know what happened in 2008. So in the first quarter of 2008 was terrible for the U.S. economy. Why? Because 2 million jobs were lost, those automobile plants were shut down, and the house prices continued to decline. So if you have friends living in Detroit, and if you talk about 2008 with them, I think they were tearing. So that's a really sad period of time, not especially for our older industrial cities. And I think Erie actually also involved. We are also considered as older industrial cities. So based on what we learned from our chapter 8, business cycle, we know when we have the aggregate demand decline, and it will shift the left away from our full employment GDP, and also we will see the country will fall into recession. And actually in 2008, it is considered as a great recession. It's not just a normal recession, it actually is a great recession. So being a policymaker, and everybody understand, or even be a responsible citizen, and your heart will be, how can we save the economy? And also, we learn in this class, we know if we try to save the economy, try to escape from recession, we have to know the aggregate demand curve has to shift to the increase, or which means the aggregate demand curve has to shift right so that it can come back to the full employment GDP. So in other words, the people will find the jobs, and people will not depress. And so, however, at this point, we actually don't know why and how to shift the aggregate demand curve, because based on what we learned last time, we just know, okay, aggregate demand curve has shifted to the right so that it can come back to the full employment rate. But why the tax or the subsidized the tax transfers can help the aggregate demand curve shift to the right? We didn't know yet. So actually, in this chapter, and also this chapter and the next two chapters will focus on the demand side of the macroeconomy by starting with the same question Keynes imposed. So what are the three questions? So what are the components of aggregate demand? And what are the determinants of the level of the spending for each component? And will there be enough demand to maintain full employment? So when I impose these three questions, you will see, okay, seem like none of them relate to aggregate demand, shifting aggregate demand curve. So why we need to learn that? So here I want to mention about because my mom is a Chinese traditional medicine doctor. So that's the heart of the Chinese traditional medicine doctor is when you really try to cure a problem, you have to find the root. You don't want to just make people feel better, so which means if they have fever, you cool their temperature. So that's just a short-term effect. If you really want to cure the problem, you have to find the root. So you have fever, it might be called because food poison can cause the fever. So if you just cooling down your temperature, you still will sick. It just temporarily make you feel better. So if really it's food poison, you have to take some pill. Some pill can help you to cure the food poison instead of just lower your temperature, right? So it's the same reason. The reason why we first study these three questions is because after understanding these three questions, we actually will be now able to know the reason why the aggregate demand curve shift to the left. So why people shift to the left. And now after we know the root of the problem, and then we can understand, we can start to learn why the policy is necessary to change the components and then so that the aggregate demand curve can shift to the right. So that is the introduction for this chapter. As I said, hopefully this will make you very interested in this chapter and make you to understand what we try to accomplish after learning this chapter.